The question really is like if you are really creating a new category, by definition, you are talking about building something that nobody has a budget line item for. And there is no clearly established buyer persona. And first, you need to convince a buyer or potential buyer even that they need something like what you are creating. That requires a lot of education, lots of convincing, and lots of original ideas, stuff like that, right? So the amount of investments that you need to make in terms of awareness and establishing that thought leadership is immense, and that is a journey that one needs to be prepared for.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. On the podcast today, we have someone who has founded 3 successful companies, created a category, sold to large enterprises, competed with much larger incumbents, and still has the day zero mindset of learning new things and building something of value. I speak to Sreedhar Peddineni, the founder of Host Analytics, Gainsight, and now GTM Buddy, about starting up in the early days of SaaS, how that has changed, and building and scaling products and revenue. This was a fascinating chat. There's lots you can learn from. So let's dive in. Hey Sreedhar, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me, Roshan. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it must have been a long day for you, and this is only one half of your day, so I'm very mindful of your time. Hopefully, you have a great time on the podcast. Also, I mean, I'm actually very privileged as well because it's not often that we have someone who has started up 3 times on the podcast. So there's plenty of wisdom on offer today. Actually, let's start there. Let's start with that fundamental question in terms of how does an engineer transform into a founder, right? As an engineer yourself, what are those core skill sets that you added to your arsenal to be able to start up companies? Again, as I said, not once or twice, but 3 times. So what are those things that you've added that made you a founder?
Sure. My trajectory is a little unusual in the sense that even though I've been leading engineering teams for a long time, I would not consider engineering as my core strength as an engineer, as a personal skill set. I'm more of a startup founder with a focus on product. So I'm a product guy more than an engineering guy. So that's how I identify myself. So my journey started 2+ decades ago now. I've gotten into startups fairly early on. I was about 27. This was back in 2000, late 2000, early 2001, when I got connected to a gentleman by the name of Jim Evelyn. Jim and I have built at least 2 of the 3 startups that you referenced. We have been on the journey together. And early stages or early steps were that Jim had already built a startup prior to that, prior to Host Analytics, and he had sold it. And he was in the stages of building his next startup, which is Host Analytics. That's when we got connected. And we started talking, and he had some ideas, and I could relate to those ideas and bring them back and work with my team to give it some shape, the early prototypes, if you will, and take it back in a way that you could present to a prospective customer. These are like working prototypes, not a full-fledged product of any kind. And that really got me and the confidence of Jim with a young guy across the pond, and we started collaborating closely after that, and decided to join hands together in building Host Analytics. In terms of my journey itself, probably the first 5-6 years of Host Analytics is what made me into who I am today as a product founder. And my early learning was all working with customers. So as I mentioned, we had built those early prototypes that you could showcase to a prospective customer. And Jim, being what he is, he was able to convince the customers and convinced on our story and so on, and someone signs the contract. Now, I would go into those customer conversations very early on. This was early 2001, where you just had a prototype and the customer is convinced enough to give us an opportunity. Now, how do you take from that initial conviction, just enough to say, okay, we're willing to go with you, or we're willing to take a bet on you, to actually understanding what the customer really wants, and how do you give it a shape? And there's a lot of learning. We're in a space called corporate performance management, which includes budgeting, and this was entirely new territory for me. So you're talking with accountants and learning about how the budgeting works in the US. So you're looking at payroll budgeting, where you're learning about what is FICA, what is FUTA, what is SUTA, all of these payroll taxes and all of that goes into the budgeting and planning. So you learn all of that from the customers, and all along you need to maintain the confidence of the customer. So how do you deal with that? Learn from the customer, ensure that you're building the right thing, and how do you retain their confidence that hey, these people understand what we are looking for and are able to deliver on our vision. So I've been in multiple situations like those. The first 5 years was a journey of discovery from customers, learning from them, and converting the ideas into reality, delivering on the product, and ensuring that you're not building a product for just one customer that you're talking to. There's always this danger in startups, especially in the early stages, where you're building for a customer and that product is something that works well for them, but it doesn't necessarily work for others. There are mistakes that we have made in terms of, there were some product choices we make early on, and it just works for that customer, they're happy. But you take the same thing to another customer, they don't have anything similar, their requirements are different. So you learn that hard art of balancing in terms of how do you move the company forward. You can't move the company forward by way of building custom solutions, then you become a glorified IT services company.
Service shop.
Yeah. So these are things that lessons learned through that journey. And I know
Right.
I took a long time, but explaining that, but I still consider that as my real schooling. That's where I learned the craft of building products, why it matters to ensure that you're not building custom solutions, how do you manage expectations, all of that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean we're talking about the early days of SaaS, right? Where we didn't have a lot of the precedents that we have right now. Yeah, that must
Right.
have been a hell of an
So
experience for sure.
just the name itself, great that you brought it up. The name of the company is Host Analytics, right? So back in those days, SaaS was not a thing yet. And the phrase that was used was application service providers. So
Right.
the idea is
PSP.
that you
Yeah.
move from on-prem to cloud. Even cloud was not popular term back then. So the idea of subscribing to software, and you would create multiple single tenant instances, and it's a long journey in terms of the transitioning from on-prem to today what we call SaaS. That's when I started my career in startups.
And like any serial entrepreneur, I mean, certainly the folks that we've hosted, they seem to have a laundry list of things that they want to do differently, right? This time
Mhm.
around. So you've been at it 3 times. What are you doing differently right now with GTM Buddy? What did you learn to do, and most importantly, also avoid what not to do as well?
Yeah. So you learn from the past in certain areas, right? Every founder, they have their domain of expertise. Nobody knows it all. At the end of the day, building any startup or building any business is a team sport. So the first and foremost thing is like, okay, you play to your strengths, and part of those strengths are the mistakes that you have made in the past, and correcting them and ensure that those don't repeat. So for me, as a person who has led product and engineering teams for a long time, we knew clearly in terms of what can we do differently, what can we do better. So in terms of the foundation that we lay on the product side of the world, in terms of the process maturity, in terms of the engineering maturity, in terms of readiness for security, a lot of those things are taken care of. Most of my co-founders and the team are seasoned people who have been part of multiple startup journeys. It's a known area where you have your bases covered, but then you get into the next things, right? I'm with GTM Buddy, I'm broadening my role in terms of what is my focus. So this is an area where I'm making newer mistakes and learning from them. So just as an example, we are in this unique situation right now where our product is way ahead of what our website says about our product. And I have been in the world where the inverse is true. Usually your marketing runs ahead of the product. So we are in this unique situation now where the product is way ahead of the way we market the product. So this is a mistake that starting up working on GTM Buddy, I knew that this could be a mistake that I might be making, wanted to be aware of it and all of that. But you always gravitate towards your comfort zone.
Yeah.
So build an awesome product, and we're doing the catch up on marketing. So that lesson is like, if I were to fix this, if I were to do a next startup, probably I'll not repeat this mistake. So I would say the thing is, for a startup or a business, you need every function to contribute. You can't just be focusing on one area to the exclusion of others, or you can't pay lip service to some things and you're just focusing on your areas of comfort where you're
Right.
good at. That's a human tendency, right? That's the same thing that I'm comfortable with certain things. There we executed very well, but there are other areas where the focus should have been more. We should have started working on our web presence much more earlier. We started about 3-4 months ago, right now, just to make a concrete example. So if there's one lesson out of all of this, it's about ensuring that there is balance across functions. There are multiple things that need to be done in building a company. And finding that balance and ensuring that your team is fairly balanced, early team. Could be the founding team itself or the early people that you bring on board. There is that balance that you maintain.
Right. Yeah, it's such an important point. I think we all tend to default to, things that we're comfortable with, but with an enterprise, I think it's important to offset our strengths and our weaknesses rather, right? With either people or, spending time and so on. One facet of your journey has been that, you've sold to large enterprises, right? Really large enterprises. And it's certainly a unique experience, I can say, because we have some experience at Waymo itself selling to these large enterprises. Our ACV is upwards of 300, 400K. What is your experience and advice in terms of selling to these large enterprises in SaaS?
Some experiences more from my personal journey, and this journey is not applicable for every company. I'll elaborate on that a little later also. So in our case, both Hostantics and Gainsight are enterprise grade platforms, and we aspire to be the same thing with GTM Buddy as well. With the enterprises, the thing is, in the early stages of building the business, how do you sign an enterprise customer is $1 million question. Not every enterprise is going to be open to experimenting with a new piece of tech with an early stage startup. So identifying a company and people who are open to such an experimentation, early adopters, as you know, that's critical. And it's not enough to have one early adopter. Usually with an enterprise, it's always going to be a buying team. It was less so during my journey with Host Analytics, but increasingly the size of the buying team is growing, as you know. It's not enough to have one early adopter who is a champion, but there are other stakeholders involved. How do you get them on board? That is something really, really important. And the second thing is the product that we have. Is it amenable to land and expand kind of a play? So in the case of Host Context, this was many, many years ago now. So let's say we sold to Pitney as a customer. Pitney, as you know, is a conglomerate of companies. So you basically sell into a subsidiary or a business unit within this large company where you land and you implement and you delight the customer. And then the opportunities open up in terms of can you expand into another business unit? And as the expansion happens, over time, you become an enterprise level standard where it becomes a global deployment. And it's a journey. It does not usually happen overnight until the company grows larger and there's a lot of credibility with existing enterprise customers and so on. So with Vimo, you're already there in terms of the logos and all of that. But I'm pretty sure early on, the situation, the very first enterprise customer, the second one, the journey would be different. We are trying to identify pockets within the enterprise where you can land. And within those pockets, do you have enough connection, multi-threaded with early adopters to land in that? Then be fanatical about driving success, delivering value. That sets the ground for the subsequent expansion. And be prepared for a multi-year journey in this. At least in my experience, it has been the case where you don't land on month one. In month three, you have an enterprise level contract. Doesn't happen. It's usually anywhere between 1 to 3 years journey. But when you get to that enterprise wide contract, you're really looking at your contract sizes going from, let's say, 100K, 200K kind of a land deal to a multi-million-dollar contract. It doesn't happen overnight, lots of hard work, but as long as we're executing well, it's a possibility.
Yeah. No, that's been our experience as well. Today, we might be tending towards a 500,000 ACV, but we obviously started off way lesser, right? I mean, 40, 50K and grew our way to this number at this point of time. And also, I mean, one thing we've noticed is the land and expand is a reality, right? I mean, there's no matter what price you close at, there's always money on the table, which is why, customer success is such a key part of the entire SaaS motion, I would say.
Yeah, totally. Now, having said that, I do speak with multiple other founders. There are some tools, if you will, that do not need to follow this path at all, especially if you have a departmental solution where the buying team is small or the product itself is amenable to PLG motions or the problem that you are solving for is amenable to a PLG motions, then the trajectory in terms of how you land the enterprise customer and expand would look very different. Probably closer home examples like companies like BrowserStack and Postman could be some
Yeah.
examples. You could land with a smaller group and you land many smaller groups in the same company. And over time, you aggregate all of this and sell into the enterprise as a whole. So there are different paths to getting there. It's just that my path was not that.
Yeah. But I think the key thing is to identify who needs your solution really, really badly, right? And really trying to solve their pain point as soon as possible and then taking it from there, right? I was listening to your SaaS Boomi podcast with Suresh, and I really loved the part where you spoke about the importance of getting the right customers. Again, this is something that is counterintuitive, right? For some of the early stage folks who are kind of listening to this, they might be a little surprised because they might feel that this is a luxury to be able to choose customers. So what do you mean by this? Can you explain a little more?
Yeah, it's definitely a luxury in the early stage. of course, but something that you aspire to. The reality is that not all customers are equal. It's not just about what's the money that they pay to you. In the broader scheme of things, over many years, not all customers are equal. So it's very possible, and I have seen this happen with a few companies, few startups, where you land a large enterprise customer, and it's a large ticket size deal for an early stage startup. But that could be a terrible first customer for you, especially in the cases that I have come across. The customer essentially treats the startup as an extended IT organization for them. And it's always this carrot, I'm already giving you a few hundred K in ACV and do this for us. Then this is going to become enterprise wide. It's going to become multi-million dollars. Months pass by, quarters pass by, years pass by. It's an elusive promise that still stays. One fine day you realize that, okay, you have still been working on that. Company is surviving because there is cash coming in. But is this solution something that you can take to the market? And will other customers benefit from the same thing? So this is an example of closing large customers very early on and letting them dictate your roadmap. If it's just one customer, then it's very, very dangerous. But if you're fortunate enough or executed well to bag a few large customers, like then you have natural counterbalances that come into play. At that point in time, you're not just trying to satisfy one customer, you're trying to satisfy three customers. So that's one. Another example, like, okay, so large customers, large contract values, they have oversized influence on your roadmap. That's the reality. Whether we like it or not, that's the reality. On the other hand, okay, is the solution going to be to work with small customers? And the smaller customers could be very helpful, some of them. And there are some of the smaller customers who could be difficult to work with. There are situations that I've seen in my life where there are customers who pay you 5% of what an ACV is, because they were early customers, and they are really difficult to work with. And once a customer is a customer, so you can't distinguish between them so much. You're still paying attention, but your ROI as a business is quite low. That's one thing. The other situation is like there are customers, especially in the smaller customers, you're able to network into the team. They're very helpful. They give you good references and all of that. But the inputs that you're getting on the product, they're not really moving the needle for you. And you spend a lot of time in terms of building the relationships with them. Where does that leave you in the longer run? So it's quite possible that one can succeed or fail with a few large customers early on. And the same could be true with the smaller customers as well. Now that begets a question on who is the right customer. Some things that my hypothesis is that you always want to work with a few customers, not small number of customers, but you have, depending on the type of business, is it 5, 10, 15, whatever the number of customers. And you have customers, their business processes are mature. Their thinking process is mature. They're pushing you in the right direction. They're difficult to work with in a right way. And they want to succeed and they want you to succeed. Those customers are golden.
Right. It's certainly one of those things, right? I mean, it's very hard to say no to cash, especially when you're early in the game. But it's a make or break thing, really, because as you mentioned, especially in the large enterprise, these customers will define your product roadmap and will have an undue influence, and they can really sway you, right? I mean, they can take you away from your mission if you're not careful. I think the key thing is to have those 4, 5, 10 customers, maybe that, you can abstract certain general pain points, certain general features, solutions, etc., and build for a larger audience. I think that is really important. And also to make sure that customers are buying you for the right reasons, right? I mean, especially I think in the enterprise, there may be like 4 or 5 value propositions that you may have, but are they buying you for that core value proposition? I remember way back when, I think maybe like 14, 15 years back, we were selling this campus admission software, right? And the customers that we spoke to, I mean, at least the first 1 or 2 of them were really happy about the payment gateway that we had, and we just wanted to sell it to them, right? I mean, obviously because it's cash in hand, but they didn't want any of the other features. Long story short, it came back to bite us afterwards. But yeah, I mean, certainly I think that's a great point. That's a very important point, that you need to choose your early customers. In the large enterprise also, another facet is that you're going up against the Goliaths of the world, right? I mean, you're going up against an Oracle or an SAP or a Salesforce or Microsoft, or if anything, you're going up against, one of the larger build shops, right? Maybe a TCS or an Infi or whatever else. What is your experience competing with these larger players? How can startups hope to beat these folks?
Yep, I'm going through the exact same journey right now. From early on, it's really important for a startup to decide how are we going to compete in the market. So, what's the basic problem statement? Who are we selling to? Having that clear understanding of the domain, the problems that we're trying to solve for, and all. And as part of that, you also look at the the existing state of the market. And in the existing state, there are vendors. If you're operating in an existing category, you're starting up, there are vendors that are well known. They have been around for some time. They have a lot of logos to display, lots of capital at their disposal, and so on. Now, given that context, it's extremely important. I can't overstate the importance of this in terms of figuring out what's our right to win. How are we going to play this game? So, one way to play this game is that I would operate in this category and I will go after niches that these companies are not focusing on. So, for example, they could be okay, I'm going after sales tech product. We are building a sales tech product, and this sales tech product, most of the market leaders are integrating with Salesforce. Now, I'm building an offering that's comparable or could be less on features or whatever the case may be, but I'm going to integrate with Pipedrive. I'm going to integrate with HubSpot. I'm identifying my niche in terms of where am I going to get my early customers from. Or the other positioning can be that, okay, I'm going after this market and the current price points are X. I'm going to be able to deliver the core value at half that price or a quarter of that price, where price point becomes my right to win. I'm delivering the value that most people need, but at a much more attractive cost point. And I'm going after the long tail. So proven models where a lot of successful companies, like look at HubSpot as an example, or Freshworks as an example, multiple companies that have been built, large companies at scale, going after the long tail. The other positioning can be that, you know what, I'm going to go up against these incumbents. And in that case, we need to be really, really clear in terms of what's our right. And we can't go with a Me Too kind of an offering, Me Too kind of a product. They have 100 features, I have 100 features, or 101 features, or 105 features. People are not going to believe you if you were to say that also. This company has been around for a decade and you're not going to win the feature one. So you need to change the narrative, and which is what we're trying to do here. And changing the narrative is not something which is just a marketing talk, something that we believe in. We do believe that there is a genuine gap that exists, and we do believe that the status quo is broken, and we do believe that there is an opportunity to redefine the game. If you have that conviction, then it becomes a head to head. The broader point what I was trying to make is that what's my right to win? How am I going to compete in this market? What's my level of understanding of the competitor? These are mission critical things even before you start writing any single line of code. And the answers may be evolving. As you learn, the answers may evolve. But you need to have a hypothesis going in. What is it that I am aspiring to build? Is there some reasonable amount of clarity on that? Am I going after long tail? Am I going to be differentiating against the incumbents? If yes, what is that differentiation going to be? And how relevant is it? Does it move the needle? That clarity is important.
And I think I also get from what you said that you don't have to default to directly competing with the incumbents as well as your first natural response, right? I mean, you may want to integrate maybe, or you may want to partner, or you may want to find a niche or something of that sort. Arguably for Salesforce, which is churning out $20 billion in cash, maybe $1 billion market is not, or maybe a few $100 million market is not viable enough for them. So yeah, I mean, I think you could certainly look at that and then grow into someone who has the right to compete against a Salesforce or that larger incumbent as well.
Salesforce is too large of an example.
Yeah, the largest SaaS company in the world.
Yeah, if you were to compare, let's say I'm building a solution in CPQ space, then that's a little bit more specific.
More finite, yeah.
Or we are in sales enablement. What is sales enablement? They're not CRM or Salesforce, but it's a category in its own right, and that category is sizable in its own right. There is a viable market opportunity there, but you're not going up against a large platform already. So when I was making those comments, I had relatively smaller platforms, and not exactly Salesforce kind of company.
With Gainsight, you created a brand new category that didn't exist before, customer success software, right? And today, category creation is in vogue, but it can also be very painful and expensive as well as a process, right? What is your advice to folks who are pioneering a new category or who think they're pioneering a new category?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this on the conversation with Suresh as well. As you said, category creation is in vogue, and I have interacted with multiple founders saying that, "Hey, we are creating a new category." It's a fancy thing to say, and a lot of times people do believe that even. But the question really is like, if you are really creating a new category, by definition, you are talking about building something that nobody has a budget line item for, and there is no clearly established buyer persona. And first, you need to convince a buyer or potential buyer even that they need something like what you're creating. That requires a lot of education, lots of convincing, and lots of original ideas, stuff like that, right? So it's quite possible that, let's say, I come up with such an innovative product that the world has never seen. Think iPod, it's an example, right? Or even an iPad. The form factor and the quality at which it was delivered and stuff like that, that's a different ballgame. If you are in that league of innovation, then it's a completely different game. But if you look at most SaaS businesses, that level of innovation is not reality. In that case, you are looking at, okay, you are solving for a business problem usually, and a problem that people don't know it exists, or they may know or acknowledge the problem, but they don't know that a solution exists. Even if the solution exists, they're skeptical about, is the solution viable, all of that. So the amount of investments that you need to make in terms of awareness and establishing that thought leadership is immense, and that is a journey that one needs to be prepared for.
Yeah, so I had April Dunford on the podcast some time back, and she had a similar point that you may want to reconsider your category creation as such, because it's a lot of money, right? And also, people have to know that, a category is created by 10, 20, 30 companies, right? I mean, it's not created by, one person. And certainly you
Mhm.
can lead a certain category and maybe become a market leader at some point of time, but that's a long, arduous journey, which requires a lot of change management, right?
Yep, yep. And
Yeah.
also, the lot of times, like as I mentioned on the other podcast as well, the category creation, like while companies do like to take credit, and maybe justifiably so in terms of the level of investment and execution on the awareness creation, the need for a solution like that, it's there. There is an undercurrent. If
Yeah.
that does not exist, then no amount of marketing investment is going to create that category.
Absolutely. So, in comparison, the category that you operate in right now has different dynamics, right? I mean, sales enablement is sort of an evolving category. It has existed in various forms over the last 5, 10 years, and people have tried to solve the essential problem of enabling salespeople in different ways. What are some things that are unique to this category that you notice?
So sales enablement is relatively a new category in terms of the way it's being used in the market right now. It's probably about 4 or 5 years old in terms of the category naming and all of that. Gartners and Forresters take the credit for that in terms of naming the category. But if you look at the vendors that are well known in the market today, that broadly speaking, there are two categories that kind of are getting combined into sales enablement. So one category is around digital content management systems. These are CMS systems where you manage all of your sales collateral content. You manage the content instead of having the content in multiple repositories. You create a centralized repository and make that content discoverable for the sales team. So that's a content management category. Parallel to that, there's another category around onboarding. How do you onboard your sales team, and how do you ever board them, or ongoing, how do you support product launches and initiatives like that? There's a learning management systems as a second category, and that LMS kind of evolved into a sales readiness platform, and content management systems were called enablement platforms. Now these two are combining. There's a lot of consolidation that's happening. So if you look at categories, like if you go to G2 and look at sales enablement platforms, you see that there are multiple different companies which are all clubbed under one category name called sales enablement. So this is a category in flux right now. And that's where we see the opportunity. Whenever there is a category is in flux, player A wants to acquire, or player A who was in the category one wants to play this consolidated game. So they're trying to mimic what the other player who was a market leader has built already. And vice versa is happening. There is limited focus in terms of the innovation. And whenever you have flux like this happening, there is always opportunities. There are always opportunities for the newer players where they don't have the baggage of thinking. Whenever you build a company, you start with certain assumptions, you make some foundational assumptions, build something, and you go from strength to strength. But there comes a point where we always make some good decisions and some bad decisions. All of us are human, and every company acquires its own debt along the way. Consider it tech debt, consider it product debt, implementation debt, lots of things. And as the company gets larger, it becomes slower. It's nature of the beast. And there comes a point where the innovation stalls. And add to that this factor of consolidation that's happening. That's the category influx. That's the opportunity that we see. And we believe that there is an opportunity to come in, and without doing the bells and whistles that nobody uses, there is a way to build a platform that truly delivers the results, where the results are not content management. Nobody is looking for, hey, I have a content management problem, so therefore I need a solution. Like companies are saying, I need my revenue goals to be accomplished, and my sellers are dealing with a buying team. Sales process is getting longer, buying team is growing larger. How do I get my sales team to be effective in terms of engaging with these buyers, varying personas? And there is also this notion of buyer enablement, where a lot of people do a lot of prior research, and only 17%, 18% of their time is spent in the purchase journey. Now, with this changing equation in sales, what would a product definition look like to serve the larger organizational goal of sales effectiveness, delivering the revenue out? So that's our starting point.
Right. Yeah, I certainly noticed that in the sales tech category as such, right? I mean, what happened around 10, 15 years back was CRM splintered into, multiple different categories. And then, we're seeing that classic unbundling and bundling, right? Which is that a lot of the
Exactly.
existing folks are trying to cover a larger surface area. I mean, if you look at Zoom Info, for example, they're now started off as a market intelligence tool, and now it's kind of become a sales engagement tool, and then so on. While they're all increasing that surface area, I think there are some key fault lines as well which have to be solved by innovation. And I guess that is where you've sort of nicely positioned yourself. Let's talk about GTM Buddy. We alluded to the category that you operate in and the sort of key pain point that you're solving. For our listeners, what is GTM Buddy? What are some common use cases that you serve, and what is the early traction that you're seeing?
Sure. So GTM Buddy is a modern sales enablement platform. I know from a marketing perspective, everybody says we are modern and all of that. But we have built GTM Buddy with sellers in mind. Today's sales are complex and sales team is engaging with multiple buyer personas, and they don't get too many shots because buyers are informed. They're doing a lot of prior research before they engage with any vendor. And the typical seller is in their 20s, most of them, and rep tenure is short, and quota attainment is consistently anywhere between 50 to 60%,
Yeah.
depending on which report that you read and so on. There's the context that we operate in. Now, if you really want to move the revenue needle, you want to move the win rates up, you want to reduce the cycle times, and you want to improve the quota attainment, how do you make that happen? These are our founding hypothesis. And within that, there are multiple sales tech tools which are focused on sales productivity or time saving tools. So it takes a long time to update CRM. So I'll make it easy for you. I'll give you X number of hours back. Nothing wrong in it. Fair problem statement. And yes, right? So there is sales productivity, which are more of time saving tools. Where we are focusing on is how do you enable a seller to be effective in that sales process? How do we get them to engage with the buyers effectively? Now, for these to happen, the key ingredient or raw material is information. The notion of informed seller, a knowledgeable seller, is critical. Now, how are companies delivering that knowledge to the sales team today? I hire a salesperson, make the person go through an onboarding program, and I even do the certifications. And I'm basically throwing them into the ocean. Here is your pipeline, go work on it. And here is a bunch of content that's available on the repository. Go use it and close the deal. Now, what we believe is that this entire notion of, I would push marketing produced content onto the sellers in the sales process, and they would share this content, and buyers are anxiously waiting for this marketing produced content. They want to read it, and based on that, they're going to make decisions. It's unreal. And what we are doing differently is about how do you enable the sellers to be contextually relevant in their sales process? How do we get them to engage with, let's say, you're selling into a business unit owner, head of a business unit, who has the business use cases in mind. And if your solution integrates into multiple other tech stack within the company, there's going to be an IT person that's going to come in. And how do you get the same seller to have integration related questions? And how do you get the same seller to do an effective demo? How do you get the seller to have a informed conversation with InfoSec team? Now, all of this information is available in the repository, but what is needed is that this information needs to be delivered to the seller when they need it. Otherwise, you just say that, okay, here is the bunch of content, you go read it. That's not going to happen. And but if I were to deliver the right information at the right time in the context of an opportunity that I'm working on, now this information is something that I'm proactively looking for. I have a moment of need, and that's when I learn, I consume that information. So, long story short, the question really is that how do we get sales team to be more effective in their sales process? How do they leverage the right information at the right time with the right persona that moves the needle forward in terms of the buyer seller interactions? How do we get them to earn the confidence of the buyer with information being the currency?
Right. Yeah, I think if you were to look at the trajectory of adoption, right, or you could think of maybe phase one was when you had a repository, right? And you could, maybe search for whatever you need, find it, and then utilize that. Phase two, as I'm seeing, is a sort of a gamified approach, right? Get what you need when you need it. Right. And this kind of mirrors how technology in general has evolved as well in terms of usability and so on. I was just making this point the other day that I don't think this generation knows manuals, right, or user manuals and so on, right? They certainly haven't read a user manual before, reading and before installing something, or before, using a like a consumer appliance or whatever it is, right? I think I'm perhaps the last of that generation. Today, whatever device you're setting up, whatever software you're using, everything is gamified, right? I mean, tooltips or very gamified approach to learning on the go, very experiential in that sense.
Yep, absolutely. And just elaborating on my earlier point about how do you operate in an existing category. So this category kind of evolved from companies having information across multiple content repositories. So I have some information on Google Drive, I have some information on Confluence, maybe I have a Notion site running somewhere. My pre-sales team uses Notion. There's some information there, some on Google Drive, some on Confluence. On the product information is living in Confluence. Now there's multiple repositories, multiple folders, different people maintaining it. So that used to be the problem. That still is the problem for companies that have not implemented a platform. So a platform, the level one problem solving is about how do I create a single version of the truth, where I create a content repository. I get all of this content organized in one place. So sellers have one place to go and search for it. That's a legit problem, right? That's level one. The moment you are expecting that sellers are going to go into a unified repository and searching in one place to find information, that's great. Now, the kind of things that you see here, if you were to look at any of the sales enablement vendors, established vendors in the market, look at the G2 reviews. Don't need to go any further. Look at the recent reviews, even where you find that, okay, when I'm searching for something, it seems like a maze. I get too many results, too many irrelevant results. So you're getting into a situation where the single source of truth in terms of the content is something that has been accomplished, but you still expect the sellers to come and search. And when they're searching, they're dealing with volume, bloat of information. Now, to your point, the sellers are not necessarily going in and finding these documents and reading those documents. They want answers to their questions, and they want that information to be available to them, delivered to them. They're not going on a search and discovery missions, if you will. And that information that you deliver, if it is relevant in the context of a deal that I'm working on, then the propensity that they would use that information goes up exponentially.
Right. And don't even get me started on versioning, right? Because I've been guilty of making, V 3.1.2 and V 4.1.5 and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly a very hairy problem that you're trying to solve for sure, right?
So as a marketer, I'll give one example, Roshan. I'd be curious to get your insights. So I'm pretty sure you would have worked on your buyer persona document. And if you're like most other companies, it's probably living in a Google slide deck or PowerPoint, where for each persona is articulated and what's their background. You probably give them a name and what are their pain points, what are the opportunities, what are the common questions that they have, and so on. Usually lives in a deck. With most companies, that's the case. Now, an actionable sales enablement platform is one that takes that persona information and it connects the dots. Hey, you're talking to someone, say Andy Smith, some name, and this person has this position title. This person is a SFDC administrator. Now, can I use that position title to resolve it back to the marketing personas that you have created and surface the information in terms of, okay, this persona has these questions. They would ask you about governor limits in Salesforce. Do you have a managed package? What kind of permissions are needed? These are the types of questions that that person would ask. Now, this information probably is captured in your personal information, but it's a document that's living in a static repository. How do you get that information unlocked and delivered to the sellers when they are having that conversation with this SFDC administrator?
Yeah, that's taking it a little further, right? Yeah. So Sridhar, you're in the 0 to 1 journey right now, and
Mhm.
you've been in this journey, multiple times before. What are some things that are really important in this journey? For entrepreneurs who are listening to the podcast, what should they prioritize? What should they not do? What should they deeply care about? What should they be absolutely thinking about in this 0 to 1 journey?
I think some of it I covered in terms of understanding or right to win. And it kind of goes back into the entire messaging and positioning. Great to hear that you had April Dunford on your show before. That is not lip talk. It's not just marketing. That is core of business strategy. And that drives actions across functions. And what is that your right to win? What is your GTM strategy? What kind of companies are you targeting? And how are you positioning your offering vis-a-vis other options that the buyers have? That is mission critical.
I think positioning impacts more things than marketing itself, right? In the early stages, especially, right? It impacts product sales, pretty much every function, I would say. And another key journey for products is to do the journey of going from a nice to have or a vitamin to a need to have or a painkiller. And considering that you've been early in markets before, right? Are there some proven ways to get people to prioritize the buying decision and kind of expedite purchase?
Yeah, it's a hard question. Probably the answer varies based on the company to company, based on the categories that they operate in. And most software products in the world, they're all position themselves as a cost saving tool, most of them. And cost saving by itself, if the economy is booming and all of that, cost saving is not something that really resonates that well, as opposed to opportunity to drive growth or reduce the pain. So how do you position that in terms of there is this acute pain that I'm feeling? Are you able to show value in terms of alleviating that pain or eliminating that pain altogether? Or are you showing me money? Are you showing me growth? Are you helping me in some way where I can connect the dots directly, not in a circuitous way, but can I connect your offering to the growth? If we're able to do that, then the product moves from nice to have to need to have. And the whole thing revolves around value and what is the nature of value. Nature of value, if it is around cost savings, it's a tested, tried, proven kind of a model. It's been around for a while, and there will always be some other products which will say, I'll save even more cost for you, I'll save time for you, and all of that. How sustainable is it in terms of, if you think about a company lasts much longer than any of the individuals. If you're building a sustainable business that's solely based upon cost savings alone, is not a long-term play. It can be a quick M&A play, of course, but a company that has the value proposition which is around, this is near universal pain, and that pain is something that I can even connect to the growth, or it's pulling my potential growth opportunities. I'm leaving a lot on the table because of that pain, or I'm able to establish a connection to the company's growth. That's important. And that value delivery, you need to have evidence as the company grows. How objectively can you articulate that value? Whether you call it your adoption data or case studies that you author, not just case studies for the lip talk, but the true value companies are receiving, your customers are receiving from you. Those are sustainable foundation for making this happen.
Absolutely. I think your value has to basically be about hard numbers at the end of the day, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you can be offering comfort or convenience and so on. But yeah, I mean, you have to tie it to numbers. And yeah, that's really important. I think you started building in the early days of SaaS when, SaaS was not a thing. Also, like you mentioned, we have this thriving SaaS ecosystem in India at this point of time. I've said this on the podcast multiple times. And if you kind of imagine three waves, right? I mean, first we had the dot-com sort of wave with the Naukri and Bharat Matrimony and all of them, and then we have the consumer internet wave with the Flipkart and the Ola and all of them, and
Mhm.
now we have the SaaS wave. And arguably, I think we've been waiting for about 20, 30 years. We've been building all of this software for about 30, 40 years, if you look at IT services and so on. And with all of the cloud infrastructure and remote and all of that, I think the time is now, right? I mean, our moment has arrived in terms of SaaS. I'm sure you must be talking to a lot of SaaS entrepreneurs as well. Yeah, what do you make of the ecosystem in terms of SaaS right now? I mean, what are we doing right? What are some things maybe we should improve upon?
I think there are a lot of things which are going right for the SaaS ecosystem broadly. I started my career back in the day when joining a startup was considered risky, and somebody on the team is going to get married, so they would come and interview me. Is this company real, or are you going to be around? Kind of stuff. That used to be the case. From there, joining startups is something that people are looking forward to, as you know. So that's something which augurs really, really well. And there is the ecosystems like PayPal mafia, as people call it. We're starting to see fresh work mafia coming into play, and with many others as well, right? There's Flipkart mafia or whoever, multiple companies. There's companies that have scaled and that are giving rise to repeat enterprise. People who have been there, done that at certain level of scale and with aspirations to go to the next level, and they're becoming inspirational role models. That's fantastic. There are some areas in terms of where the bandwidth availability, that probably there's not enough of bandwidth in terms of product management, as an example, or people who are messaging and positioning experts, great content writers who look at the broader scheme of things and who can author content. There are some gaps. I know it's going to be a function of time as the companies scale and people go through these experiences and all of that, that supply would increase. But apart from that, from a funding environment, someone was telling me that the VCs in India have more capital chasing relatively smaller number of startups. So there's more capital available in India compared to the US. There is more capital, of course, and the supply of potential startups is significantly higher. So funding environment is very favorable despite the current downturn and all of that. I'm very, very bullish on India SaaS.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've learned to build somewhat, right? I mean, if you look at the last 15 years, maybe I think product has been a defining sort of a function, right? It's certainly come of age. We will obviously add a lot more product folks and so on, and that'll get better. But yeah, I mean, we're learning to sell, right? In the process of learning to sell and position and brand and market and all of those things. And I think that's going to be a really exciting leap forward. Sridhar, this has been a fun chat. It was, amazing talking to you about all of these various facets. Indeed, I could talk to you for a lot longer, but you've had a long day. Before we leave, any books or podcasts that you would recommend to our audience?
Likewise, Roshan. So, couple of things. So it's kind of, I go through waves in terms of areas of interest. So of late, been reading up about cognitive biases. That's a topic that has been of a long time interest, and again catching up on the reading. So there's this book that I'm reading currently, Art of Thinking Clearly, by Rolf Dobelli is the author. Still about 25% through that, but really enjoying it right now. In terms of the podcasts, I do listen to multiple podcasts more on topic based. But one thing that I started recently listening into is a podcast called Vedanta Talks, a little bit on the spiritual side, not as much religious, but where there's this person who talks about Upanishads and Gita and kind of distills down the wisdom in those texts. That's I find that really fascinating, and he talks about in a very secular way, in a way that I'm able to relate to what that those texts are saying. I find that fascinating.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Sreedhar, and all the best for everything that you have coming up.
Thanks again for having me, and have a great evening, Roshan.
If you enjoyed this podcast, consider subscribing and leaving a review on your favorite platform. Also get updates delivered straight to your WhatsApp inbox by clicking on the link in the description.